Welcome to chapter 6 of Wuthering Heights. There's a lot going on in this opening paragraph because in this opening paragraph, we learn that Hindley returns home for his father's funeral, but what sets the neighborhood gossiping is the fact that he returns with a wife. What she was and where she was born, he never informed us. Probably she had neither money nor name to recommend her, or he would have scarcely kept the union from his father. And there's so much going on here. Now, first off, I love the mirroring. It mirrors the fact that his father had brought home Heathcliff, and what he was or where was born was not known. But yet, his Hindley's wife is for the most part accepted into the community, whereas Heathcliff is ostracized, and we can assume possibly it comes down to skin color. But the detail that I keep fixating on is what she was, not who she was, what she was, which makes her seem like a different being, like as a different object. And it would probably be similar to how they would categorize Heathcliff, that whoever she is not of their people, not of the Moors, acts, sounds different. It would be probably similar to how they would probably describe Lockwood. What is he? He's different from us. But maybe she's of a different nationality. We don't know. We really aren't giving much this point. Maybe I'm wrong. I'll find out. It's been, again, a while since I've last read this. And she is a character that I don't fixate on, but this time I will. And so maybe we'll find out that she comes from a different nation, like France or something like that, or some like other part of the United Kingdom. And like there's something about her that is just slightly different. And so they deem her, what are you? But it's fascinating that she's deemed a what, not a who. But I also like the hypocrisy of Hindley because he's so adherent to the social order. Like he's very much aware of his placement, and he feels threatened by Heathcliff, that he might usurp him as the eldest son, what he might inherit, and what is expected of him. And we see it being illustrated later in the book when him and his wife are both determined to force Kathy into being a proper young lady and make an advantageous marriage, whereas they had themselves possibly had not been an advantageous marriage because we do not know her name or where her money had come from. So this is obviously a love match, but it's not like it's hypocritical of like thrusting Kathy into doing what society expects of her, but not having done it themselves. And he is very much aware of it himself because he wouldn't have kept the union from his father. You would think if it was an advantageous marriage, he would have, told his father to prove to him, like, hey, I'm exactly who you want me to be. I'm the perfect son. This is one of his many flaws, despite trying to fit into what society wants him to be, expects him to be, the role he has grown up thinking he needed to adhere to. And we're going to see the role that Hindley believes that he's supposed to adhere to is going to cause a lot of problems down the line for him. So we're kind of seeing like how society's expectations on everyone in this book kind of brings about their downfalls. The next paragraph gives us kind of a glimpse at what Hindley's wife is like based off this like kind of telling by Nellie that, she describes how she would run around the house. Like she would have not one that would have disturbed the house much on her own account. So she's not someone that's coming in, charging and changing things. She's not a strong force, but rather she finds every object appeared to her delight. And a part of Nellie thought that she was half silly from her behavior while they went on. And it is in complete opposition of Kathy, who is very much a force herself. She dictates every room that she kind of comes into, or is like a gravitational force that everyone is drawn to. And she kind of commands other people's lives around her. It's my impression. Even subconsciously, she's not fully maybe doing it intentionally. And also, like, just the wife, Henley's wife, is deemed so like half silly. There's a childishness to her, whereas Kathy is very brilliant, even from a young age. Nellie recognizes that there's a smartness to her, and when she would tease them and manipulate them, there's a smartness, whereas the wife is deemed half silly, very childlike, and so they want to nurture her and coddle her and care for her. And it's showing like the two different types of women and like the two different types of women that society thinks that, even though there's obviously a broad range of women, but like what society kind of wanted was someone like Henley's wife, someone that's very beautiful, that wouldn't make a fuss. And you want to nurture and coddle and protect them, but at the same time, like, do you really want someone like that when you want someone that's capable and smart like Kathy? But if you have someone like Kathy, who's the other extreme, she bring about the downfall of your family, as we will see. And this continues also with this, like with the wife being afraid, and she's saying that she didn't know, but she felt so afraid of dying. And Nellie remarks that she was rather thin but young and fresh complexion. I did remark to be sure that monitoring the stairs made her breathe very quick, that the least sudden noise set her all a quiver, and that she coughed troublesome sometimes, but I knew nothing of what these symptoms pretend, and I had no impulse to sympathize with her. And so it's showing like not only like a hardness of Nellie, that she had like no sympathy towards her, but that's also showing like they live rough. They're in the moors. They're a hardier people, and that whatever Henley's wife is not of a hardy, you know, upbringing. She can't hold this. She's giving very much like the sickly child of like the Secret Garden, like that kind of essence, and very opposite of Kathy, who's obviously very hardy, but also the fear of death we're seeing here, which Kathy in her moments when she is racked with sickness and death doesn't quite seem afraid of death, but more so mournful of losing a part of her life and regretful of moments in her past. But like, I don't know. I think it's also fascinating that Henley's wife, we don't know if she was fearful of death prior to coming here or if it's just this environment. So, what does it say about this environment? Is this like a weird in between place where life and death hangs so casually? The moors maybe representing that area of kind of in between. Like, there's so much we could probably pick apart in a metaphorical sense, but I'm just putting it out there for now. I want to dig into this a little bit more a little bit later, but like this detail I find fascinating, that coming here already there's a sense of his wife fearful of death. Like this house itself is haunted and she's afraid of every corner is going to pop out or something's going to get her. Also, I'd like to note that we have not been given Henley's wife's name thus far, so I've been forced to call her Henley's wife, giving her autonomy in her presence and her name in association to him. Think of the Handmaid's Tale of Fred, Offred, of Fred. So like your name is association to the man that is in possession of you. So like we will eventually learn her name, but at this point, it's not deemed worthy of telling us. Nellie's not telling us like, oh, he brought home a wife. Her name is this. She is just an extension of Henley in this case. That she is nobody. She just is there. She plays a small role, but she's not important at this moment in time. She's just an extension of Henley when she first arrives. So what does that tell us about women? And I think Emily Bronte is talking about that, how easily women can lose their identity, especially in marriage, that you just become an extension of your husband. I think is a commentary that she might be having. I want to once again remind everyone of the youthfulness of the characters in this book, because that plays a big role and is very easy to overlook. And that influences how we perceive these characters. And I'm bringing it up here because in this chapter, we learned that young Earnshaw was altered considerably in the 3 years of his absence. And I thought he has to still be pretty young, because back in chapter 4, Nellie tells us that Henley was 14. Like she directly tells us he was 14 when Heathcliff first arrived. Now we don't know exactly how old he was when he was sent away to school, but we could surmise he either was 14, 15, maybe 16 at most. But presumably still on the fairly young side of it to be going to school. And so that means that him returning, he's either 17, 18, 19, maybe 21 at most. That is still very young to be coming back married and master of not only a house with servants and all the people inside that he is in charge of, but presumably an estate. That's where they're getting their money from, is the people that they lord over. We don't hear much about that though, but still, he is very young. And the point I want to bring up with this is that many of you might be assuming, well, that's average age for them to get married young and be mature, but that's a misbelief that has been propagated through, I don't know, media, books, which is so sad because they could be such a great way of preserving history, but also we're learning that it's also a great way of creating a misbelief, as we see with tight lacing your corsets and so many people trying to yell back, that's not true, that's not how it was. It's the same with the ages. Like, they weren't marrying extremely young. The average marriage age was about 20s, mid 20s, early to mid 20s during this time. So also, like, the age of majority for, like, say, young men to come into their money would be about 21, 25, somewhere around there. So he is still fairly young, and that should play a role in how we perceive these characters and his decisions and his interactions and things like that. And same with Kathy and Heathcliff and all the others when they come about, because, or like play more of a role in the story, because we're not much different nowadays to how they are then. Like, we still, our brains haven't changed in this time. We still aren't fully developed. Our frontal lobe's not fully developed till about 25. I am 95% sure that is it. But so his brain's not fully developed. And the frontal cortex is also making like those important decision making. And that's why you also have young men in the army, because they just run out. They're not forming that, ooh, this might be a bad idea. Not as much. But also, like, your heightened emotions. Think of your teenage years. They're feeling that too. They're not much different than us. And we need to remember that with the story, because it's so easy to forget and put adult thought processes and feelings into this and not think of, like, I don't want to say forgive them, but kind of forgive some of the decisions and actions throughout the story, especially with Kathy, for instance, that she was very young, and it's a tragedy for how young she is. It's the same as Romeo and Juliet. Like, we need to, like, it's been hounded into us now to remember that they're young, but it's easy to kind of slightly age them up, still not realize how young they are. But like, their youthfulness should play a role in how we perceive these characters and their thought processes and things. Like, we shouldn't be aging them up. And it's similar to say, like, Hamlet is one of those where, like, there's a lot of arguments going back and forth of how old Hamlet is. There's a lot of academic papers going whether he's young or old. It's definitely feels like he's older because of often mature actors want to portray him, but he could potentially be young, which would then not quite justify but understand his emotions and thought processes. And the same here, like, it's Heathcliff's decisions are coming from someone that doesn't have a fully developed frontal cortex. Same with, or Hindley coming forward. I'm rambling, but I just really want to reiterate that we should remember their ages, because that is going to be playing a role in their emotions and their decisions. Just as I said in the beginning of this chapter, we're seeing kind of a hypocrisy going on here. In this manner, Hindley had returned, and he had grown spare and lost his color and spoke and dressed quite differently. And on the very day of his return, he told Joseph and me we must then first quarter ourselves in the back kitchen and leave the house for him. And what this tells me is that not only are they losing that community and that sense of almost equalness that we saw with his father when he was the master of the house, but which is going to influence a lot of things going forward, but we're seeing Southern sentiments coming in. That is a very, like, idea that would have been coming from the peak of society, the noble classes, like those ones coming from the South, I would say. I am talking out of my ass. I could be completely wrong, but like, he's coming from a different culture almost, and he's implying it here. So it's so fascinating that he was afraid of Heathcliff usurping him. He's an outsider, he's a foreigner, but yet, and even Nellie tells Lockwood that we are wary of foreigners at first. And yet Hindley leaves and becomes back with such foreign ideas. He's trying to implement these foreign ideas to their region. And what some, like Lockwood, maybe would categorize as civilized some. And at the same time, we're seeing that Hindley has grown sparer, has lost his color. And so one would argue that he has become less a version of him, that the people that live amongst the Moors are maybe a little bit more wilder but colorful and like lively. you could say. So we're seeing like a dynamic which we also saw kind of being played out in North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, which is a Pride and Prejudice kind of retelling for its Victorian time, looking at the differences of the Northern industrialization versus the Southern elitist society. And so I'm pulling a lot from that too, but like we're seeing it kind of being discussed here. So we're seeing this divide between the people from the North and South, but it's always kind of been present of like those who lived farther away from the capital and the center of society. And we even see it, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, those who live in the country are deemed less civilized, as we see with, Caroline Bingley. But what I'm trying to get at is that it's like I think Emily Bronte is trying to have a conversation of like preserving the culture and the traditions within their region and how important that is. And it's not just amongst different nations, not just like, the Scottish versus the English, but like the different regions of England. We're seeing them being impeded that, like, with the increase of ability to travel, you're, yes, learning more, but you're losing some culture. And it's something, for example, we see in the United States with states that, like, each state kind of has their own unique culture. But yet, we're slowly over the years have been losing some of that culture and traditions. And I think that is one of the things that like Emily Bronte is kind of digging at about this because she has traveled and returned home. So I wonder if this is playing a role here. I'm rambling again, but it's just very important to me that the hypocrisy of like him, hating Heathcliff for being such an outsider, but yet Hindley, who yes was born amongst the Moors, returns so different and is implementing Southern sentimentalities in the Northern home and changing them for it. And I think he kind of represents someone trying to adapt to those ways, whereas, Kathy is someone that almost bucks against it, you could say. One of the things I'm discovering through both my close read literary analysis is that both Emily Bronte and Jane Austen are amazing writers because they utilize mirroring. In their books, there are so many occasions where they mirror characters or situations to further a conversation that they're trying to have. So in this moment, we're seeing it being done with the way that she's presenting Hindley and his wife, and once again, we still haven't gotten her name, but the moment that she becomes peevish, that is when Hindley becomes tyrannical. And that a few words from her of dislike of Heathcliff were enough to rouse in him all his old hatred of the boy. He drove him from the company to the servants, deprived him of the instructions of the curate, and insisted that he should labor out of doors instead, compelling him to do as hard as any other lad on the farm. And what this is mirroring is this kind of all-consuming relationship. So normally we think of Kathy and Heathcliff having an all-consuming relationship, and even like Kathy, like I said, has this thing about her that like is a black hole that people become sucked in and obsessed with. Like we see it with Nellie, we see it with Edgar, but there's some autonomy with the two of them, not like even like Heathcliff has some autonomy, but like there's this all-consumingness. And we're seeing something similar here with Hindley and his wife, but yet it's slightly different. And it's showcasing that each of these relationships do have good qualities, but equally are toxic. Every relationship in this book, for the most part, except for the final one, is toxic to some element. There's varying levels of toxicity. So it's not black and white. You're not going to get a relationship that's just bad, just like the one that Heathcliff and Isabel will have later. There are varying levels of bad relationships. And in this moment, it's showing that Hindley and his wife, you could argue, it seems nice that he's concerned for his wife's happiness and comfort, that he almost immediately wanted to change the parlor to carpet it and put papers, except that his wife liked the open rooms and stuff, so he ended up changing his mind. So he is looking for her comfort, but it's going too far, that he's changing too much and is so easily persuaded by what she thinks. And the moment that she is out of the picture, he is in a black hole of depression. And she's not a force, not in the way that Kathy is a force, is not brunt, but yet something about her is persuading and dictating Hindley to be, even though Hindley is more the force, if that makes sense. So what I'm trying to get at is that Emily Bronte is showing that the world's not black and white, that there's not just one bad relationship or one toxic relationship. There's varying levels, and even those toxic relationships have some good in them, but they can still be toxic and unhealthy. And we're seeing it here. There's another aspect that I want to touch on within the same kind of paragraph that I just talked about on page 54 in my copy. And it has to do very gothic in a sense of like something about this house, something about what it is right now is almost as if it's been possessed. Almost as if, say, Heathcliff brought the devil with him, is what Nellie would argue. That all of a sudden it's become this haunted house. Think things like The Conjuring, where the house becomes uninhabitable until they have exercise of all the bad ill. And it makes the worst out of people. And I say that because we see, for instance, Hindley's wife come in. Again, we still don't have her name. And she's a little airheaded, but happy and joyful and finds everything cute and charming and loves everything, and even is excited when she discovers that she has a sister amongst her new acquaintance. She prattled to Catherine and kissed her and ran about with her and gave her quantities of presents at the beginning. Her affection tired very soon, however, and when she grew peevish, Hindley became tyrannical. And then we're going to start seeing a change in her. And there's something about this house, even Hindley coming back, you're kind of given this impression that he seems happier until his wife becomes peevish, and then all of a sudden he throws Heathcliff out. That he was fine with Heathcliff kind of being around. Like, he didn't obviously love him, but he didn't throw him out until his wife became upset. And there's something about this house that almost makes you more negative. Like, there's a negative energy of this house that brings out the worst in people. And it's just sucking. And we see it even in the opening chapters with young Catherine and Heathcliff and the others. There's something here that brings out the worst in people. And it's, I think, bringing in Hindley's wife, who's silly but joyful, and then losing that joy so easily in this house, I think is illustrating this gothicness. So I think Emily Bronte is kind of creating this element that, gothics typically do have ghosts, but she's not doing that. She's not making supernatural of this house, but yet kind of giving an essence of the supernatural, but yet kind of showing that a house can just become toxic and it affects everyone within it and influences them, and it can become sudden, and it's based off maybe the people or something on the land. Like, whoever you talk to, you're going to get so many different impressions, but there's something here that is affecting people, but yet at the end of the day, we have agency over how we kind of do it too. But like, there's a lot of conversations you could have about this and about the house itself. And it, again, in an allegory kind of way, it's like it's being possessed by a demon and is bringing out the worst in everyone here. There's a lot of conversations you could have about this book, one of such being the kind of power and autonomy and societal expectations, or just a couple. And I'm bringing those up because Heathcliff bore his degradation pretty well at first, because Kathy taught him what she learned, and they worked and played when he was in the fields. And they promised Fair to grow up as rude as savages. The young master began entirely negligent how they behaved and what they did, so they kept clear of him. He would not even have seen after they were going to church on Sundays. Only Joseph and the curate reprimanded his carelessness when they absented themselves, and that reminded him to order Heathcliff a flogging and Catherine a fast from dinner or supper. So what we're seeing here is, first off, a change in my perception, because I think in my head I just assumed or remembered wrongly that Hindley returned home and became immediately tyrannical, that he brought back his previous annoyances and anger, but he didn't. He was happy and he was fine, and he kept his distance and was absorbed in his wife and that kind of life, didn't care about those two to their enjoyment. So it's the influence of others like Joseph and the curate, who you could argue are stand-ins of masculine expectations. Like, they're the ones pushing Hindley towards this supposed masculine expectation that he should run this house tyrannically with an iron fist and have the children adhere to what they believe. And that pushes Hindley into becoming mean and tyrannical, because he could have very easily have just been indifferent, which, like, it's again not black and white. Like, this is good because he, like, them Joseph and the curate getting involved pushed him towards being a horrible person, where and prior to that, he left Kathy and Heathcliff alone, and they were happy. But by leaving them alone, he equally was allowing them to grow up to be savage and rude, which you wouldn't want kids to be, and you kind of have to steer them towards goodness, I guess you could argue, going on here. However, the steering done by Joseph the curate and Hindley pushes them more towards evilness because it's harsh and mean and cruel with floggings and fasting. It's not kindly pushing them towards it. But at the same time, we have to remember Hindley is, like I said previously, anywhere between 17 to like 21 here. He's a child still himself. His frontal lobe is not fully developed, and yet is, supposed to not only run this estate, which he probably has tenants, and that's where his income's coming from, has a new wife, but also has children that he's supposed to be rearing. Like, he's a child himself, and that's got to be strange. And so, like, just a combination of all these is creating this toxic environment. But I also want to point out that, like, what Kathy and Heathcliff is showing is that they were kind of left wild, and they wanted to be left wild, which allowed them, which one could argue is wild, but another is freedom from societal expectations. Kathy wasn't expected to adhere to what a young lady is expected to be like. She was allowed to be herself. Heathcliff didn't feel the pressures of society's impression of him or assumptions of him. They were free to be their genuine selves, and their genuine selves were wild and savage. Today I want to focus on this particular quote, and there's a lot to get in with it. So with this quote, it is when Kathy and Heathcliff both promised fair to grow up as rude as savages, the young master being entirely negligent how they behaved and what they did, so they kept clear of him. He would not even have seen after their going to church on Sundays. Only Joseph and the curate reprimanded his carelessness when they absented themselves, and that reminded him to order Heathcliff a flogging and Catherine a fast from dinner or supper. There's a lot going on here. On one hand, I want to reiterate Hindley's age. Like I said, we do know he was 14 definitively when Heathcliff arrived. We don't know if he was sent off to college within that same year or a couple years after, but even then, we can assume him returning. He's roughly anywhere between 17 to 21, presumably. And all of a sudden, now the master of the house, he's also married and, infatuated. His frontal lobe's not developed, and he's in charge of not only the tenants that are the income and running this household itself with its servants, but also these children's education. Things are going to slip through the cracks, and it's his sister and this random kid that he would much prefer to ignore existence, which would make him much happier and not be involved in any way. But he has to, as Joseph and the curate remind him, that is his job as the master, the man of the house. And that gets into something I was doing research for a essay I was doing, but I don't even know if the research is going to be a part of the essay. But the Enlightenment and Romanticism era philosophy once again pops back up. It's like just keeps popping up in everything I'm touching lately. But there's the way that this has been touching everything from philosophy, politics, society, even children rearing and education. And prior to the Enlightenment, the way that children were seen and treated is vastly different, thanks to the Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Jean Jacques Rousseau, and how they then saw children as actual beings. And not only that, as like tabula rasa in John Locke's case, a blank slate that they need to put attention and care to their upbringing to steer them towards goodness. And that's what's being reflected here, because this book, once again, the events of the story is taking place late 1700s in the midst of the Enlightenment philosophies. And Emily Bronte, while being a Victorian lady, would have grown up experiencing these change between the Enlightenment and Romanticism, but also just being a part of removed, she probably would have felt this transition from prior to the Enlightenment to the Enlightenment, because Joseph and the curate, I think, represent the men prior to the Enlightenment, that they also thought that it was just, strictness and religion and also order, whereas the Enlightenment kind of added more love and coddling, and some would say spoiling of the kid, because these two men also encourage looser fitted clothes so that the kids can explore nature and learn instead of the stiff adult clothes that they would have been put in prior. So these two men are representing the old ways. They're the embodiment of the old ways. And Hindley is standing on the precipice of potentially adopting these new changes coming from the South, where these new changes would have been in discussion. And we see him wanting to implement things from the South, with him wanting to paper the parlor, things like that, to create a difference between servants and the owners of the house. But then Joseph and Curate push him towards tradition, towards the old ways. And these men are in part a part of this problem. They are not the sole reason behind the toxicity of this household, but they are a big focus. They even affected Mr. Earnshaw, the old Mr. Earnshaw, who would have traveled. We saw him traveling to Liverpool to city, so he would have been familiar with these ideas, hearing them in coffee shops. But then he is pushed by these stronger-willed men who are secluded in their small-mindedness and small communities. On top of that, we are also seeing that the young master being entirely negligent how they behaved and what they did, so they kept clear of him. Kathy and Heathcliff being kids are very familiar, and they kept clear, and it worked for the two of them also, and it would have kind of adhered to the enlightenment of like nature education with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, like let them go and learn. But at the same time, Hindley would have not fully adopted the enlightenment thoughts of like you need to steer them towards goodness, and he wasn't doing that. And even here, he doesn't fully involve himself. While he is dishing punishments, he doesn't do it himself. He is reminded that he should order a flogging of Heathcliff, not that he needs to flog Heathcliff. And even the fasting of Kathy, he would be the one deciding this, really. It's someone, a servant would be not bringing her food. And it's similar to like Ned Stark. Think of him saying in the very first episode of the first season that he believes that if you are the one to sentence someone, you should be the one to follow through with the execution. That's what's kind of going on here too. He's washing his hands of this, and that doesn't make it any better. So there's a lot going on here. I am probably just scraping the surface still, even with just that. But because my recent research, this was just like such a paragraph that I'm like, I have a lot to talk about. And again, this is something that like Emily Bronte is so good at, is there's just so much to talk about. There's so many layers. Just a scene like this is something that you can read and go, yep, that adds a role to one aspect of the story, which is the toxicity of the household, and move on. But you could also do something where you just happen to be looking into children education, how society saw children, and then fall down a rabbit hole about the Enlightenment idea of educating children, which then led me to this specific paragraph. And that's what I love, stories like this, where you just happen to be like, hold on, let me just look up one thing, like how the children were seen in society, and fall down a giant rabbit hole. And that's why I love doing this so much. I want to talk about the punishments given to Kathy and Heathcliff in this instant, as Hindley was reminded that to order Heathcliff a flogging and Catherine a fast from dinner or supper. Neither is worse or better than the other, in my opinion. I'm not trying to downplay one or the other, because I think they both are physically harming the individual. Heathcliff's is more external. You're going to see the external effects of it. They're harming his external body, whereas Kathy's is harming her internal body, which is very fascinating that I think about it, that like everything evolving around Kathy and Heathcliff is external and internal. Like everything with Heathcliff is externally done, like he externally affects other people, whereas Kathy internally affects people. You judge Heathcliff externally based off his color of his skin, whereas internally we judge Kathy based off her personality and how she, interacts with others, you could say. So it's a whole thing that you can pick out there. But getting back to the punishment, so Heathcliff's might be external, Kathy's is internal, because starving a child is equally bad, because it's going to affect their ability to learn, to grow, to develop without having enough food. There's plenty of research in it. I actually touched on that a little bit when I studied abroad in Sweden and took a teaching class and got to go to some of the schools. But one of the things was talking about kids having breakfasts. And that just having enough food being important to the like not only their physical development but their mental development. And so taking that away is equally harmful, if not long-term harm, but both can be mentally long-term if you think about it. But also, like, they both feel very religious in the punishment types because you probably see things like that in the Bible. One, though, seeming more like you fast religiously, but often you do it with your own agency. You decide to do it, whereas this is being done as a punishment. So this is going to push her away from religion, one could argue, which we see, and why her ghost is wandering the moors and not gone off to heaven. But what else was there? There's so much else I can talk about with this, but there's just that. The difference. Oh, the sexism, too. The genders of like, well, we could physically harm him. He's a boy, but not the girl. But you're not realizing you're still harming her. And like, you get into the whole thing of like punishment. And then like the same thing that I was talking about previously with the Enlightenment thinking of like the previous generation's way of treating kids was a lot more physical punishment, I guess, being involved, whereas there's a little bit more coddling, as some naysayers would say, with the Enlightenment style of child rearing and education and coddling and spoiling of them. So like it's you're seeing that being played here too. There's a lot to pick at, and again, I'm just scratching the surface. We're still working on the same paragraph from the last video, but I want to focus on two specific lines within this paragraph. And because it's Emily Bronte, these lines are rather long, and this video is probably going to get rather lengthy because there are a lot of parts within this that I want to pick at. So the lines go, but it was one of their chief amusements to run away to the moors in the morning and remain there all day, and the after punishment grew a mere thing to laugh at. The curate might set as many chapters as he pleased for Catherine to get by heart, and Joseph might thrash Heathcliff till his arm ached. They forgot everything the minute they were together again, at least the minute they had contrived some naughty plan of revenge, and many a time I've cried myself to watch them growing more reckless daily, and I not daring to speak a syllable for fear of losing the small power I still retained over the unfriended creatures. First, let's look at the chief amusements to run away to the moors. As I previously mentioned, I am in the process of working on an essay that I'm going to publish my Substack and post, like film and post video, I'm hoping, on YouTube and TikTok, talking about the essay I'm working on. And one aspect about it is the Moors and what it represents. And in this case, the Moors is this untamed, wild, untouched by man, because it is so infertile that you, in like rough, that you can't quite master it, which again goes into man versus nature and man's hubris of thinking that they can master nature. But it's untouched by man, by society, and this land in this book sits between Wuthering Heights and the Lintons estate, Fresh Cross Grange. I always blank on the name, but the Grange. And Wuthering Heights and the Grange represents society itself, both of them in general, society and the pressures of society, but like Wuthering Heights represents, I think, more the northern sentimentality, whereas the Grange represents the southern, advancing London society, those kind of things. Wuthering Heights used to represent the old ways, stuff like that. There's a lot you can unpack here, but in this moment, the Moors represent being untouched and unpressured by society, and that's why Captain Heathcliff seek solace there. That's why they often go there, because they are leaving the pressures of society. They're leaving the pressures of the curate, Joseph, Nellie, the Lintons, Hindley, his wife, trying to shove them into these specific boxes that they are not meant to shove into, that they are too big, like the boxes are too small for them. And we see it with the curate punishing Kathy by reading as many chapters to memorize the Bible, which I kind of think is interesting that you can unpack separately, about him using the Bible to push Kathy into being a good Christian woman. But I feel like it's such a negative, it's a punishment, so it's going to have a negative connotation that's going to shove her farther away from it. Like, I think it's not going to work in the way that he thinks it's going to work. And like all these, like I said, all these pressures. So the Moors are supposed to represent like them being free of it, and together they're free of it, free of these pressures to be who they truly are, see their true selves amongst each other. And once they're there any punishment that they would have would be worth a laugh because they know at the end of it they would escape and run off and spend the day, all day. A punishment is worth spending all day free of these pressures, that they're free to be themselves, that they can snub their nose at society thinking that they don't have to adhere to it, that they won't fall prey to these societal pressures, that they will continue to be themselves because they found an oasis. They think this, at least, wrongly. And then moving on, she says that they forget everything the minute they were together again, at least the minute that they had contrived some naughty plan of revenge. And the thing that I want to fixate is on the latter, not the former. Most people would fixate on the former and see it as romantic because actually the essay I'm writing about is that Wuthering Heights is not romantic in the way that we think it is or have been led to believe. There has been historical points that I found that have pushed us to this narrative, but I think it's more of a relationship in general, not romantic relationship, though there is a romance, but it's not romance in a way that we want it or think of it. It's more in this relationship of what they think that the other person represents, in the same way that Gatsby loves Daisy, but not for her person, but what she represents. I can't wait to share this essay when I finally finish it. I'm very close. But being amongst the Moors and being together, they're happy because they see each other for what they are. Like, that's why they are often together, because Kathy does not view Heathcliff for his color, race, his, where he was born, all those things. He sees him as him. And same with Heathcliff or Kathy. He does not pressure her into being feminine, being smaller than she is. He wants her to be loud, exuberant, and encourages even her worst self, but he's encouraging her to be kind of her true self in a sense. Again, both to the negative things, but the thing I want to focus on is the latter. They're not happy until they are planning revenge. They could be together, but that's not enough, apparently. It's not enough till they are scheming a plan of revenge. And that should catch your attention because this book is fixated on revenge as one of the themes. That a lot of these events that happen is on revenge. Hindley's reaction and abuse to Heathcliff as it happened throughout the rest of this chapter in the next couple of years is because he is seeking revenge upon Heathcliff for perceived slight, that his father liked him more. And then Heathcliff seeks revenge upon Hindley for what he has done, and for Linton, and for all the others for not picking him, and for belittling and all these things. And Kathy seeks moments of revenge too, petty revenges. They all seek revenge. And it's making this toxicity that is causing the downfall of this black hole to exist in Wuthering Heights that makes everyone sad and miserable. It's revenge. But the final thing I want to fixate on is that the punishments and what they're trying to do, and also what Nellie says, which is that many a times I've cried myself to watch him growing more reckless daily, and I not daring to speak a syllable for fear of losing the small power I still retained over the unfriended creatures. What she is pretty much saying is what I said in a previous video about the education and the Enlightenment period of, one, I like the Moors because it's leaning into Jean-Jacques Rousseau's natural education, going out in nature and exploring and things like that, but also him and John Locke encourage that we should be involved in children's upbringing and do it in a particular way to encourage goodness, that we have the tabula rasa, the blank slate, as John Locke had, said. And what is happening here is that Nellie is taking a hands off, I had no role in this, but she did. She had total agency. She could have intervened, but she didn't. She could have. She was supposedly the friend. She is a similar age, seen as a big sister, but she was afraid of losing that little power, which again, power is being a big part of the story too. We see power in the changing of power, and who has power? Often the men. And Nellie, being a woman, is more fearful of losing it because we have so little, and she's acknowledging that she has so little. So there's the whole power aspect, but also she could have steered them towards goodness, going into the Enlightenment ideas of children rearing and children education. The curate's trying to do it, but he's doing it in such a poor manner. Joseph's doing it in the manner prior to the Enlightenment's education, which is beating the goodness into them, which doesn't work, obviously. Which, Like, Nellie could have, and she doesn't. Nellie could have steered them towards goodness, towards they're away from the recklessness, but she doesn't intervene. And I think that's part of the story is those that don't intervene but are watching horrified are equally at fault. They could have equally stopped this. And yeah, so like that whole thing I want to point out is that like the involvement, like you could have been involved. You're equally at fault for not just sitting by and watching this disaster happen. The power dynamics with her saying her little power, the feminine and masculine powers and things like that. Because she said that they're unfriended creatures, which yes and no. I think she could have put herself out there. She could have become a closer friend with the two of them if she wasn't fearful. I think of Joseph, the curate, and Henley for herself, which again, feminine masculine powers. They thought that they only had each other, which made it worse, I think is what she's trying to get at. But I also want to get at they were growing more reckless daily. And that's because no one was taking their education and their upbringing, guiding them towards the good Christian light in the way that they should have, which led to their downfall, I think is what it's trying to say. Again, I'm rambling, but that is just 2 lines in this. There's so much unpack. It was just 2 lines, and that's why I love this story. And I look forward to hopefully soon in the near future to share this essay I'm working on because I've been working on it for a while and I think it should be something interesting to think about at least. So question the romance, which is what I'm also going to be doing during this read through, is questioning the romance. Nellie goes on to talk about how one particular Sunday, Heathcliff and Kathy were banished from the sitting room for possibly making some noise. She's not entirely sure what exactly happened, which gives it more credence because, as I've pointed out in another video, in If We Were Villains, the very first episode of Serial, the podcast about Anand Syed, the reporter made an example with her nephew and his friends that it's very hard to remember exact detail of a particular day unless something stands out. And this kind of detail wouldn't be something that Nellie would remember, but it most likely they would have made too much noise, been banished because that has happened often enough. But then when they are called down for dinner, I went to call them to supper. I was to discover them nowhere. We searched the house above and below in the yard and stables. They were invisible. And it's the word choicing here that snagged my attention, the nowhere. They were invisible. Because it almost creates this image of the two of them being more like imps, fairies, changelings, which makes sense with the location of Wuthering Heights so close to the moors, those being so close to nature, this unknown, untamed. They're going to believe a little bit more in the mythology, with the folk tales and folklores to understand the unknown. But also, Emily Bronte is living during the beginning of the revitalization of fairy popularity. I did a separate essay I was working on, and I discovered that Victorians really got into fairy folklore and stuff like that, thanks to, I want to say Walter Scott, but do not quote me on that name, but he revitalized Scottish mythology with his works and things like that during the Victorian era. So we're seeing a lot with that, the folktale, but also like Nellie could have described them as missing, gone, but she doesn't. She says they're nowhere, invisible, which fairy folk could become invisible. They exist in a plane that is nowhere, that it's hard to discover the doorway to Anon or other world where the fairies exist. And it almost is mythicalizing Heathcliff and Kathy as though they are not humans themselves. They are complete other beings. They are fairy-like. They're devil-like. They are not like human. And it almost is like Nellie's trying to use this as justification for their personalities, for their flaws, for their anger and revenge, and the fact that they didn't conform to society is that because they are not human, they're something other. Because like a part of us doesn't want to recognize that if someone like these two could do things like this, do such heinous things, what does it say about us, the possibility as fellow humans, I think is what's kind of being comicized here. But it's also fascinating from a 21st century point of view because these two characters have become mythical in a sense, just as Romeo and Juliet and, Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot and Guinevere and all of them, that they become unrealistic and almost fictional lies, whereas in reality, Emily Bronte is pointing out that these people are amongst us. We are like these people. We have them within us. We have the capabilities. They are not mythical. That is capable of us. I think I'm rambling. I hope that made sense. Once again, weather is very important, especially during this era of writing the romanticism. It usually symbolizes something, but we have rain. So it's rain often is cleansing the earth, revitalizing, bringing new growth, new life. But it also is commanding you indoors, bringing you towards society, one could argue. And that is kind of what is happening here. That is kind of what we're seeing foreshadow, because when Heathcliff does emerge from the rain in the middle of the night, and Nellie confronts him so he doesn't wake Hindley and cause more of an uproar, she discovers it's only him and not Kathy. And one could argue that the moors are to represent untameness, nature, like an oasis away from the pressures of society, as I previously mentioned. And the rain drew Heathcliff back to society, that despite their big dreams, he has to come back to society. That you can dream all these things as a kid, but eventually you have to join society, you have to be a part of it. But also, the foreshadowing part is that Kathy was lost to society first. And we're going to see that when she chooses to marry Edgar Linton, it's her choosing to go with society. We see her changing her ways first compared to Heathcliff. Heathcliff changes his ways and becomes a part of society after Kathy does. And so we're seeing that the rain is almost a catalyst, that it drew them away from the moors and towards civilization, towards society. And Kathy is someone taken in first, and it's almost done like she's forced. She doesn't really choose to, because she becomes injured and is taken in by that family out of kindness, but then they, she's conformed. So it's like almost like she doesn't choose to go to their home, into society. She was forced into it, which is foreshadowing later events, whereas Heathcliff actually chooses to change his ways and become a part of society. So like this, I just love the layers when you like step back and think about it. Like, it's in itself, it's a beautiful story, but when you think about the layers of it and the foreshadowing, things like that, like I've never noticed this before, obviously. It's extra beautiful. Upon Heathcliff's return, his solitary return, Nellie asks, where's Miss Catherine? No accident, I hope. He responds with F Brushcross Grange, and I would have been there too, but they had not the manners to ask me to stay. And this is our first kind of true step towards Heathcliff really having to interact with society and seeing his downfalls, because it's almost like Wuthering Heights is its own vortex. Like, I think we don't hear about them going to church. Like, we hear that they go to church, but we don't hear about how he interacts with others at church or things like that. And it's like he's partially accepted in Wuthering Heights. So going to Freshcrest Grange is almost like going into true society and seeing how society would treat someone like him based off his appearance and based off assumptions or tales. And it's because of these that he is shoved away, separated from Kathy. It's foreshadowing their later events, that society, to be a part of society, is going to separate them. That the way the society is today, he is going to be seen one way thanks to his physical appearance and deemed not good enough for someone like Kathy. But Kathy is also going to be thrust into a position where she loses agency, where she doesn't get a choice either. So this is kind of like his first taste, but I also love that he says that they did not have the manners. So I think it's also pointing at that someone like old Mr. Earnshaw had what would be considered good Christian values, that he had this kindness to offer home and food and clothes and love to this poor child with nothing, and had what we should consider as manners. But yet you have the Lintons, who epitomize what society of that time would deem manners and good societal values and things like that, because they're adhering to societal values, but yet they shove him out of doors into the rain and do not offer him warmth and comfort like they do for Kathy. So do they have good manners? So we're having this kind of conversation too of like, to be a part of society, you're adhering to rules, but then you're also kind of have a cruelness to you. It like, you're adhering to prejudices and beliefs to uphold the society, to uphold the system. But then there's a cruelness to you. So are you really a good Christian for doing that? So we're having this very subtle conversation had here too. Nellie demands of Heathcliff why him and Cathy went to Thrushcross Grange, and as he's getting out of his wet things, he tells her that they had escaped to ramble at liberty, and getting a glimpse of the Grange lights, we thought we would just go and see whether the Lintons passed their Sunday evenings standing shivering in the corners while their father and mother sat eating and drinking and singing and laughing and burning their eyes out before the fire. And there's a lot going on here, like everything else in this book, but also the light, I think, represents a couple different things. And the light is what snagged my attention. The Moors, as I previously mentioned many times, are untamed, untouched by human hand nature. Like the Moors physically themselves are such a harsh environment that humans can't quite churn it over and inhabit it. They can't claim it for themselves. And this is the land that Affy and Heathcliff find peace in, that they seek sanctuary in, that they can have the freedom to be whatever they want, to grow wild. And in their own childish heads, they think that they too are untouched by man, that they can grow in the wild way that they wish. However, the light lures them back. The light of society lures them back. Curiosity killed the cat. That despite wanting to go into nature, you're still drawn back to society, to community, that having just one person actually isn't enough, and that you're still curious to know more. And you see it with so many tales. You see it the Jungle Book, you see it with the Little Mermaid, you see it even with like the great poets of like, Walt Whitman, who supposedly existed in the woods, but really he wasn't that deep in woods. Like things like that. We are still continuously drawn back to society as humans for some reason. And the other thing that the light representing is also what the Lintons and Thrushcross Grange represent. So Wuthering Heights represents the old ways. It represents the last generation with a harsher kind of upbringing. Like I mentioned previously, the education style of children is the previous generation of like, strict. They would be dressed stiffly like adults. They would be, punished. They would be constantly taught about religion and things like that, whereas Thrushcross Grange is seeing the next generation's version, the Enlightenment's version of education, which is coddling their kids, as critics would say, but is a lot more involvement, a lot, nicer, looser clothes, freedoms, stuff like that. So Thrushcross Grange represents that, but also they represent almost like London society, the South society, the society and etiquette and stuff encroaching on the northern culture and traditions, whereas Wuthering Heights holds to those traditions. You see it with the way that they treat their servants or how they live, their house styles, like that. Like Thrushcross Grange represents the South and Wuthering Heights represents the North. And of course, Cathy and Heathcliff would be curious to see what it would look like, just like, again, Little Mermaid being curious what the other side looks like. It's a grass greener. And especially because what Heathcliff says there, that they were curious how they passed their Sunday evenings. Were they standing shivering in the corners as their mother and father sat eating and drinking and singing and laughing? Again, looking at the old ways that children are ignorable and punished, whereas in this way they're not. And also imposing Hindley and his new wife the mother and father role and critiquing them. And while they get punished, which you then have nature versus nurture, was it always in their nature to become the way that they become, Cathy and Heathcliff, or were they nurtured that way because of the harshness of the environment that they grew up in? Which then you have such an interesting thing of like the harshness of like the Moors compared to the harshness of the civilization with Wuthering Heights. What would have been a worse environment for the two of them to have grown up in? There's so much you can unpack here with, again, just this simple line. Heathcliff continues by saying, "Do you think they do, or reading sermons and being catechized by their manservant and sent to learn a column of scripture names, and if they don't answer properly?" And the thing that caught my attention was and being catechized by their manservant. Because we're seeing not only pride being showcased here from Heathcliff, but also a hierarchy and a hypocrisy of it. That the only reason why Heathcliff and the servants such as Joseph and Nellie had so much power and autonomy and agency and kind of seen as human beings in Wuthering Heights in the first place by old Mr. Earnshaw was because there wasn't that divide. They were part of the family. It was when Hindley came, then they were separated and kept removed. But before, they were seen as part of the family and given more power compared to Fresh Cross Grange, where there's a divide. Like you have the house, you have the family, and you have the servants. We're seeing that already being implemented by Hindley, as I've already said. But I think it's hypocritical because, Heathcliff wouldn't have had that agency and power if it wasn't for Earnshaw being so open and good like that. Like he could have very easily been kind of treated in almost a governess kind of position where you're not quite servants, not quite family. You're in this weird, lonely in between. And also, we're seeing humanity at its worst. I think Emily Bronte is showing our worst aspects that is encompassed in every single one of us, whether we like it or not, which is that we inherently have this desire to put ourselves above someone else, to gain a little bit of power. And while we might try to be good and can be good, there's still a little part of us that want to be better than someone else, to be a step above someone else. And I think it's just how our society works, and it just becomes, I think, maybe more so nurture than nature. It feels like nature at this point, but I think it's nurtured in us to need to be above someone else. And I think you can kind of see this with like Heathcliff's upbringing, like even before him coming to Wuthering Heights, he would have seen that he was treated so poorly and below people. And then he gets a taste of being slightly above and wants more. He's greedy. We see that with Kathy too. They're both greedy and hungry and have pride. They have a lot of the sins. But it's fascinating how he gives him such airs and pride in this moment of him being offended that the Lintons didn't have manners to keep him in this house, that they don't have a manservant lecturing down upon him. So, like, we're seeing how he's offended that the Lintons didn't treat him as an equal, but then he also wants to be above someone like Joseph, that he wants more power above Joseph, that Joseph shouldn't be his equal and talk down to him, things like that. So, I like these are things that you kind of can miss because you're just reading the story, the story itself is brilliant. And same like Hunger Games, the story itself is brilliant, but what makes it exceptional is when you dig into these layers, when you pick at it, when you dissect it in this case. And I think Emily Bronte is having such a very powerful conversation in this book about class and expectations in society and the hypocrisy of everything. And like even like I said previously, the light being, Wuthering Heights versus Fresh Cross Grange and the two generations at the end of it, neither is paradise because you're still going to be repressed in both these environments, especially someone like Kathy, who is a female in both these versions of society. She, at the end of the day, will still be repressed. So there's a lot that you can talk about, and I'm rambling. Nellie and Heathcliff's conversation kind of had me have a thought I've never really pondered before. So with Heathcliff wondering, like, would the Linton kids spend their Sundays shivering in a corner, being sermonized by their mother and father, or laughing and drinking by the fire? And Nellie responds, probably not. They are good children, no doubt, and didn't deserve the treatment you receive for your bad conduct. And my first thought went to chicken and the egg. What came first? Or is it even possible to deem one coming first? Was it because that they were bad that they had to be sermonized, but obviously that's not doing anything? Or were they made even worse because of being sermonized? And being sermonized in this style, the rearing of children in this particular style that Joseph and the curate are adhering to, the old style, you have a 50-50 chance in my mind of either them becoming worse or becoming so traumatized and removed from society. And that's living like you can theorize like what if they were in a loving home like the Lintons and spoiled? Well, technically they were with old Earnshaw, and look how they are. They're spiraled and run rampant. So what kind of upbringing could steer them in? And in Nellie's perspective, at least the way I've been interpreting Nellie's perspective, is that there's nothing you could have done. They would have probably gone the same way. That's why I kept my hands off, which this is having a conversation of so many things, which is like the rearing of kids, the theoretical, like you reach a point you can only theorize would they have been different if it was a different environment, but would a different environment have truly changed? Is it nature versus nurture? You know, the thing about parenting that you can only try your best, but there's no guarantee in how your kids are going to become as adults. And also touching on something that I touched on with Alchemized by San Liu, which is that being someone like Nellie, being someone that's like a bystander, hands off, like I'm not involved, does that make you better or worse than the people who pick a side and staunchly stand by it? Because you're still watching atrocities happen. You're still involved, even if you're not involved. So then do you deserve the punishment of one side? Like all those conversations are had in some of these alchemized, but like it's applying kind of here because Nellie's like, they were terrible kids and there's nothing I could do, but she had influence. Not a lot as a female and as a servant, but she was slightly older than them. She was a sister, and she even kind of slightly brags about herself being a figure that they would come talk to. So she did have influence. She could have steered them, but she saw that, oh, I had no sway over them. I mean, it doesn't seem like she tried that hard. Like she tried a little bit, but not hard enough, possibly. So she could have influenced them. She could have been a good influence, but she kept a hands off approach because of why? Because of who they were, because of her who she is as her personality. So then you're having a conversation about that. Like I've never really fought too hard about Nellie. I've actually definitely seen her more negatively in the past. But now I'm like pondering, like, okay, she's not that much older than them. She's still young herself, pondering her gender, pondering her situation, especially in a household now with Henley separating servants and stuff. But even before, like, she could have been an elder sister. She had that kind of position technically, so she could have helped them, but she doesn't. We're continuing a conversation I've been having in this chapter, especially where Heathcliff's saying that we ran from the top of the heights to the park without stopping, Catherine completely beaten in the race because she was barefoot. You'll have to seek for her shoes in the bog tomorrow. And to me, it stands out because, like, it makes them seem more wild and more attuned to nature. Like, she's even removing her shoes, which you could deem a constriction of society, and letting her feet touch nature as she runs wild, you know, completely stepping away from what is expected of a young lady to be quiet and demure and not running wild in this way. But here she is being her truest self. And especially when she has her shoes taken off. So, like, the shoes can represent society's constriction because, like, you know, shoes can constrict your feet and prohibit you from running fast, for instance, literally. So there's a lot you can unpack here. Once again, the descriptions, especially of nature, is very important in this book, and especially during the Romanticism era, it is rich with symbolism, hence why a lot of their books are used in English classes. And again, also it's used previously in the past to represent stuff, but especially in this era, and especially with nature. And we see it here with like Heathcliff saying that we crept through the broken hedge, groped our way up the path, and planted ourselves on a flower plot under the drawing room window. This nature is extremely different from the nature of the moors and Wuthering Heights. We don't really hear much of them having a garden, really. We hear about the stable, we hear about the house. It seems very, in movies, often portrayed as rough stone, and that's about it. And then they're bordering the moors, which is untamed wild nature. But Freshcross Grange is a nicer house with a tamed nature that has been manufactured and influenced by man. The hedges, there's a broken hedge in there, done by man probably, than nature itself. And then you have the path, and you have the flower plot. Yeah, the flower plot. So all these things, the flower plot means that like this is flowers that they planted, not wildflowers. So we're seeing them emerging from the bogs and the moors of wild nature with their shoes off and such, wanting wild to this beautiful, what looks like paradise of comfort and beauty, but it's completely controlled by man, with down to its nature, to its house, to the children, to everything within it is heavily influenced by society and what society deems pretty and acceptable. And even down to like its nature, you have to have clean nature is what I'm saying. So everything has layers to it. It has symbolism to it, even the house and what it represents. And so once again, Kathy and Heathcliff's journey is being lured by society and what it could offer you, but also forgetting or not realizing the setbacks that they personally have as a female and as someone that does not adhere to societal standards, as someone of color, of different background, of different ethnicity, possibly. And so they're at a disadvantage, but yet they're still lured by society. They still want to somewhat be a part of it until they realize how much they are repressed by it, how much more free they were in wild nature away from society, but yet the light of the Grange still lured them in. So I recently realized that a lot of my favorite authors were previously poets or grew up writing poetry, and you can tell it in their writing because these authors, for example, Emily Bronte and V.E. Schwab's are two examples. Every word is chosen consciously because of poetry having a limited real estate. You have to be very conscious of your word choicing, and then each word has to have like a wealth of layers to it. And you see it here, for example, that some might just assume that Emily Bronte just needed these two characters just to look in and kind of kickstart events, but she doesn't. You don't get that sense of her just setting Kathy and Heathcliff outside the window of the Lintons household just to kickstart events. You feel that there is more to this moment than just that. And having Kathy and Heathcliff sitting outside the window that had not been shuttered, partially obscured by curtains, and Heathcliff describing the inside as it was beautiful, a splendid place carpeted with crimson and crimson covered chairs and tables and pure white ceiling bordered by gold, a shower of glass drops hanging in silver chains in the center, and shimmering little soft tapers. It is very opposite of Wuthering Heights, which is very rustic, very cold and drafty, is the impression that we get. But at its center, it has its hearth, it has its home, that it has its heart of its home. And when, everyone's at its center, it can be warmth. It's a family. But lately, everyone's been pushed to the excess rooms and it's colder now. And here we're seeing this opulence, this paradise esque, like American esque dream. I guess you can say something to acquire, to dream towards. It's like the green light in Gatsby, just out of their reach as they sit on the other side of the glass. These two specifically is important because society is luring them in. I think Emily Bronte is talking about this like lure of society and wanting to go towards it. And because of its dazzling you, you forget that you are one of those people that will never be accepted in. And we see it with these two, that Heathcliff will never be accepted in. Like, he could get all the money he wants, he can claim a house, but he will never have what the Lintons have. He will never acquire or earn or even create something as similar to this opulence. He will never be accepted because of how he outwardly looks and his history. And history is so important during this time. This is a time where you don't go into a new neighborhood without having like a reference, a letter of reference from someone else that knows someone within that community to welcome you into homes. Kathy, meanwhile, might be allowed in, but she's never going to fit in. It's never going to be the same. And as Kathy is allowed into this home and opulence and she puts on this exterior of fitting in, interior, she doesn't. She feels like an outcast. She feels like she's wearing clothes that are 3 times too small. We see this playing out. So it's just fascinating that these two characters are looking in from outside in the cold, and it's luring them towards it. And it's like this lure society is a part of their downfall. That if they weren't lured by what is equivalent of the apple in the Garden of Eden, they might have found some contentment in their life, but they didn't. Society became the apple, one could argue. Once again, the curtains might just be blue, but not to me, and probably not to Emily Bronte. I believe that just with her description of the Lintons' house, or just at least the room that Kathy and Heathcliff are spying on through the window, is having a conversation with readers, and it's probably hitting on ideas and topics and issues of its time that those readers would have been a lot more familiar with. So it might have been more apparent to those readers what is being said here. I may not know all of them, but I'm going to try my best on what I at least think based off this description of the room, because it's opulent. It's not only this green light-esque apple in the Garden of Eden luring them towards society, but you see the polarizing takes. Like there's a reason why it's dazzling, the two of them. And Heathcliff describes that the where is this? A splendid place carpeted with crimson and crimson covered chairs. First off, crimson is such a dark, deep red. To acquire that shade would have required a lot of dye, and that's money. That's to have such a rich dye like that, that would have meant money was involved in this. Also carpeted. Like look at Wuthering Heights. It's stone and wood, natural, easy to acquire, and material goods. Maybe they'll have a rug, but it would have been a handmade rug, a rag rug, most likely made out of scraps. Carpeted, that's money. That's harder to make. You don't quite make it. It's most likely a factory, or harder to do, and it's a room that is carpeted. But it's also creating this coziness, whereas the wood and stone naturally are colder materials, especially in the environment that they're existing in. It would be cold, whereas carpeted is warmer. It gives off this warmth to the room. And this color too gives off warmth. And to have crimson cloth chairs and tables, that's more fabric, more textile, more, and like that's more money, because again, we're not quite up to the Industrial Revolution, so it's not easy to make these materials, because again, their childhood took place in the late 1700s. We're not quite close to the 1800s. We're not taking place in Emily Bronte's lifetime. This is previously, and so we're not at the Industrial Revolution. It's not easy to make these fabric goods. And then we have a pure white ceiling. You know how hard that would have been to maintain in that time, with fireplaces and soot? That would have meant that servants would have been cleaning that. It's the same as why the rich would wear white before Labor Day, because, and you would have these images of the elite wearing white because they can keep it clean compared to lower classes. And so this pure white ceiling is hinting towards them having servants to clean this daily. And then you have it bordered by gold. So you have this wealth and purity. Like white and gold gives off this sense of angelic, this innocence, but crimson gives off the sense of blood. So one could argue is, what did they do to achieve this wealth? What kind of blood was shed to acquire this wealth and give, or what kind of blood was shed to give this illusion of angelicness? One could argue that in order to have the wealth, it has to be on the back of someone else, especially during this era of society. And then you have the shower of glass drops hanging in silver chains from the center, shimmering with little soft tapers. Again, tapers would have been very expensive, because it's not like they're a lot harder to make and it's a nicer quality wax. Usually lower classes would have like the wax made out of the fat of like animal fat and it gives off a weird smell and it doesn't burn as soft and light. So this is beeswax most likely and it's expensive. And you have these glass, a shower of glass, which I think is showing not only their wealth, but the fragility of this illusion, this idea, how easily it can fall. Look how the Lintons had fallen thanks to Heathcliff. Everything here can easily be wiped away. It could come crashing down. And it's already saying this the glass drops, a shower of glass drops, as if it's almost there, or even that anyone could be harmed by these glass showering down. There's so much that you could kind of pick at. I think I'm still even here just brushing the surface on this. There's more I could probably get into if I sat here long enough and thought about it, but I think I've talked about this moment for way too long for everyone else probably sitting here. But I would love to know what you think this description could be hinting towards. What do you think the symbolism of this scene of the crimson carpet, crimson clothed tables and chairs, the white wall ceiling and gold, and all these things? What do you think it could mean? Whenever it's overcast like this, I feel like it's extra fitting that I'm recording Wuthering Heights, especially right now where the trees are bare outside my window compared to when I first started recording this in summer. It's taken a while, but I'm really digging into it, as you can tell from this video alone, or this chapter is extra long because there's a lot to talk about. And getting back into Heathcliff's tale about what had happened to when he's telling to Nellie, when they look into the window, he says that old Mr. and Mrs. Linton were not there. Edgar and his sister had it entirely to themselves. Shouldn't they have been happy? We should have thought ourselves in heaven. And one of the things I love best about reading classics and reading a book like this is that there is no hand holding. That is something I yearn for books coming out today, and especially movies and TV shows, or even worse, that there's too much hand holding, too much telling the audience exactly what is happening. There's not laying enough breadcrumbs or puzzle pieces for us to put it together and engage in the narratives. And with this book, we're not told outright what Kathy and Heathcliff's childhood looked like, but we're told enough to know that after old Earnshaw had died, they were often annexed. The last moment of Earnshaw's life, as told by Nellie, was all of them in what is the common family room by the hearth. Joseph, Nellie, Kathy, Heathcliff, old Earnshaw, all by the fire, all together. The moment he dies, Hindley comes in, and then they're all annexed to far off rooms with, we could presume there's not really fireplaces in, because like Lockwood didn't talk about a fireplace in the room that he was given, so it doesn't seem like there is fireplaces, or if there is, they're not often lit, so they're much colder. They're not at the heart, at the very least, the heart room, the family room. Whereas the Freshcross Grange, it doesn't quite seem like there's a main family room that they all go in, as you see even here that like the parents aren't in this room. It's an opulent room. It looks like a room, it should be the room that everyone gathers in, but they have it to themselves. And it's warm, it's brilliant, but it's just the kids. And to Heathcliff's childish mind, he thinks that's heaven, to be left alone, but that's only because Hindley has been in charge and the lifestyle has changed so abruptly that I think if old Earnshaw was still alive, he would have felt pity for them. That why isn't everyone all together, as he notes, like everyone together, everyone a family. But because of what is occurring right now in their life with Hindley and being annexed and being constantly, when they are found, being punished constantly, having a room so opulent, so warm to themselves seem like heaven. And it's also kind of Heathcliff saying that I think it's a dream that he would love to have in this moment in time, to have such a rich room for just him and Kathy, to almost be a part of society, have wealth, but yet not be a part of society, to have the benefits, but not the rest of it. Because the rest of it is the society. To have that kind of opulence and wealth, often you have to be a part of society. And like then they can't be together, as we will see. Like there's I'm rambling. There's a lot that you can unpack with just that here. Heathcliff then continues and says to Nellie, and now guess what your good children are doing? Isabella, I believe is 11, a year younger than Kathy, lay screaming at the farther end of the room, shrieking as if witches were running red hot needles into her. Edgar stood on the hearth, weeping silently, and in the middle of the table sat a little dog, shaking his paw and yelping, which, from their mutual accusations, we understood that they had nearly pulled it in two between them. The idiots! That was their pleasure, to quarrel who should hold a heap of warm hair, and each began to cry because both, after struggling to get it, refused to take it. We laughed outright at the petted thing. We did despise them. When would you catch me wishing to have what Catherine wanted, or find us by ourselves, seeking entertainment and yelling and sobbing and rolling on the ground divided by the whole room? I'd not exchange for 1,000 lives my condition here for Edgar Linton's of Rushcross Grange, not if I might have the privilege of flinging Joseph off the highest gable and painting the house front with Hindley's blood. There's a lot to unpack with this. Starting from the beginning of the excerpt I just read, he talks about Nellie saying that what good children they are. And he's like, they're not good. And we're seeing again this conversation about children's education. As I mentioned many times so far in this chapter, at this moment in time in history, there is a switch between how children are treated and how they are educated, thanks to Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, bringing them in, treating them like children and not like little adults, and seeing them as tabula rasa, a blank slate that needs to be guided, and like how you do it. And the naysayers think that this new way is more coddling of them. And yes and no. It's the same as like today. Like you have varying like styles of parenting, and it can be good if you do some of them in moderations, but there's always extremes. And in this case, it's showing like Kathy and Heathcliff's upbringing and then Edgar and Linton's, they're both extremes. Like Kathy and Heathcliff are still wild, and their punishment from the previous style of parenting and education only made them worse and negative and more aggressive and angry. But Linton's are coddling and they're too soft and spoiled, as we see as they fight over a pet, and they're fighting with each other over something so simple, so innocuous. And it seems silly to Heathcliff, who doesn't have a lot, and he thinks because he doesn't have a lot, he wouldn't fight Kathy over what she wanted. But also, we have to remember that Kathy could tell him to do a backflip and he'll do a backflip. Like he would do whatever she wanted, as we are told numerous times up to this point. And I think it's also seen like, how is she not devoted? They're thinking, aren't they siblings? And I think this is the first step also for Heathcliff to realize that it's not sibling love that he feels for Catherine, it's romantic love. Because at least from Heathcliff's perspective, but I have an essay I'm working on. I've mentioned it previously, where like it's not romantic in the way that we think is romantic. It's romantic in the sense of that he sees Kathy as an idea, and he's in love with the idea that she represents. If that makes sense, I can get into this separately if anyone wants me to, but the fact that like he says I wouldn't trade 1,000 lives, my condition here, for Edgar Linton's, and I think it's because he has Kathy in his, and like having that opulence and being that spoiled doesn't seem appealing to him at this moment in time until he has Edgar Linton has Kathy. Then all of a sudden he wants that wealth and things. So I think like Heathcliff, partially while lured by Freshcross Grange, isn't lured by the idea of society and wealth, if that's what it means. I think he just wants a home and a family and Kathy, and to be attuned to nature. That's why they go out to the moors and why he wants Wuthering Heights. But we're also starting to see the first hints of him seeking revenge, of him wishing that he could fling Joseph off the gable and paint the house with Hindley's blood. There's a violence to him, but the violence, you have to then question, is it nature and nurture? Was it always in him, or was it nurtured in him thanks to probably the text that he was being forced to read from the Bible, from Joseph's flash, yeah, like whipping of him and things like that. So there's a lot to unpack in this moment. I'm rambling. It's very lengthy, this little thing I'm going into. And I'm probably just scratching the surface of this whole discourse. And like, obviously, I'm going back and forth because each sentence, like, it seems like Heathcliff is lured by this, but then it also seems like he's not lured by this, like, temptation of what Freshcross Grange represents. So I think he could also be saying that and it's not being truthful. So there's this whole dynamic here. One final thing I want to say and point out is him saying that Isabella is 11, a year younger than Kathy. Kathy is 12. And in the next moment, we're going to learn that Kathy stayed with the Lintons as she healed. And then all of a sudden, it's thrust into becoming a woman. 12 is typically the age of puberty, but it still is rather young for her then to have to convert into being a woman and then gets married shortly after. We have to remember that she is a child, so she is rather young, so we need to never forget her age. That is the one thing I really want to dig into in this read through, is to remember their ages, because that should influence how we think about them and their decisions and emotions and choices, because again, the frontal cortex is not fully developed, and that is playing a big role in this. That is part of the tragedy of the story. So we then have Heathcliff saying that they had laughed, and that's what caught the attention of the Linton children, who start crying out for their parents. And he says they really did howl out something in that way. We made frightful noises to terrify them still more, and then we jumped off the ledge because somebody was drawing the bars, and we felt we had better flee. And it's the line, "We made frightful noises to terrify them more," made me immediately think of fairies. I mentioned previously how at least the child version of Heathcliff and Kathy give off a very like changeling fairy-like impression, which makes sense for the location. The moors is rich with fairy folklore. I don't know a lot myself. I did read I can't remember if it was an academic paper or like an article or something. I'll attach it down below, about Wuthering Heights and the moors and fairy culture and its ties and its influences. And you see it here because, like, for instance, at the base level, fairies often are being portrayed as a little bit of a trickster, but mean tricksters that they taunt and tease. And especially like these ones being on the other side of the window, existing amongst nature and the moors. And there's this slight cruelness to fairies often in their portrayal. And this is also the era of like a renaissance of fairies. The Victorian, I think Emily Bronte might be on the very beginning of it, but the Victorians, there was a renaissance that came back into style, that all of a sudden more people were writing about them and reviving the mythology. But you have in these regions like where Wuthering Heights takes place, it would still be existing. It still would be such a deeply ingrained folklore. Take, for example, like where I live, the Appalachia folklore seems like stories to me because I live far enough away, but those who live closer to Appalachia, it's true. They believe in these legends at least enough to be wary and cautious around the woods and certain noises and things like that. So initially this is giving a very fairy-like impression, but the other image that came to mind is them at the window. And my brain immediately went to Kathy at the window, her ghost. And it's almost like foreshadowing how Kathy and Heathcliff will haunt, literally, figuratively, in the, every form, the Linton family. That they are the demonic presence that kind of bring them down with them. And yeah, there's a lot more you can say, but those were just the first two images that came to my mind when I read that line. With this next excerpt of lines, I'm going to get very blue curtains with you. So they start running. He had Kathy by the hand and was urging her on when all at once she fell down. "Run, Heathcliff, run," she whispered. "They have let the bulldog loose and he holds me. The devil had seized her ankle, Nellie. I heard his abominable snorting. She did not yell out, no. She would have scorned to do it if she had been spitted on the horns of a mad cow. I did, though. I vociferated." God. "Curses and nothing annihilate any fiend in Christendom, and I got a stone and thrust it in between his jaws and tried with all my might to cram it down his throat. There are a lot of things I'm going to pick apart. This is going to get a little lengthy. First off is Kathy and Heathcliff running together, but Kathy being the one seized by the dog is slightly foreshadowing what's going to be happening. If you see the dog as society with his jaw clenched around her, seizing her, preventing her from running off and being who she wants to be, her truest self. And it's almost though showing that no matter what, society will come and claim you. It would either have to bend to its will and play along, or you will be ravaged by society. You have to adhere to societal expectations of womanhood. For example, for Kathy, that she's the first one to be claimed, which is what will happen. She will be the first one to be claimed by society, and only because she goes into it marrying Edgar Linton and dresses and acts the part of a proper lady, Heathcliff follows suit. He also then adheres to societal expectations, and they become less wild, less their true self. So the dog is kind of the embodiment of society coming to claim them, that they can only run for so long before it will claim them. It's nearly impossible to outrun society or this dog. The other thing I want to point out is Kathy's lack of reaction. And we don't know if Heathcliff is painting her in almost a more martyrdom kind of way, or braver, which Kathy, at the very least, like even if it's not true or it is, Kathy at the very least is different than other young ladies. She's not swooning like one would expect from a young lady or a girl being attacked by a dog, not like Isabella would have been doing. She's staring it down and holding herself and not crying out, and it's calm in the face of a storm, a danger, which is brave but makes you wary of her. You go, what's wrong with her? Why is she not afraid or crying out? She's only 12. And that makes you a little hesitant. And if it was, I don't know, an earlier century, they'd be like, witch, like that kind of thing. So it's showing that she already is very different. But why is she willing to withstand this? And one could argue that she is willing to withstand possibly holding back the brunt of society to protect Heathcliff, to get him away from this dog, to protect him from converting, keeping him to his true self. But that backfires, as we will see, that even though she marries Linton and is trying to protect Heathcliff, he instead adheres to societal expectations in order to win her, he thinks, stupidly or childishly. There's a lot there, but I also want to one final thing is pick at him saying that um I vociferated, why do I keep saying this word? I don't know how to say this word. Curse is enough to annihilate any fiend in Christendom, and I got a stone thrust between his jaws. I like the almost double entendre, I guess you could say, of the curses enough to annihilate any fiend in Christendom, because when you can see it as like you're facing, for example, a devil and you're cursing it away, like you're sending curses. You can say curses in the sense of like a curse, like you curse someone, ill will kind of thing, but you can also see it as curses, like, saying curse words. So, like, on one hand, if you see it as curse words, you're saying, like, well, obviously, this Christian teaching that's been happening didn't do anything to, the way that Joseph has been preaching to him in the curate, that didn't do anything. And one could argue that was always within Heathcliff's nature because he's described as being possibly gypsy. But so is curses based off of a false impression society had of gypsies. They believe that they would have curses. So, in both senses of the word is being applied here, and him being against Christendom. So, almost like this moment here doesn't bring him closer to Christendom or being saved as what others would deem like Joseph and the curate, thinking that old Edgar, I mean, Edgar. Old Earnshaw bring him in would be saving him with Christian, those kind of rhetoric that would have been very popular during that time too. Instead, he bucks up against it because of the harshness of it. So I hope that made sense. It kind of is just like me talking out loud as I'm like thinking about this. So as I said, there's a lot to unpack here. This chapter itself has a lot to unpack here. I still have like another couple pages left. I'm sorry, like 2.5 pages left. I'm sorry this is getting very lengthy, but I hope that this has been interesting, and I would love to know what comes to your mind when you read these lines. One of the reasons I hate that our society has really upped the romance of this story, even though it's not romantic in my opinion, is that we lose very important themes that Emily Bronte is so brilliantly and so subtly having a conversation about. And these themes are probably why many in her era thought a man had written this. Because, for example, in this moment, we're seeing like a conversation about class and assumptions about class, assuming that those who embody more metropolitan heirs or smarter and more moral, whereas those who might be more country or of a lower socioeconomic standing should be ridiculed and seen as lesser and dumber. Whereas, like, for example, we're seeing here that old Earnshaw brought in this orphan child with kindness. And then in this moment here, when Kathy and Heathcliff are caught, one of the servants assumes that they're part of a robbing gang, that their job would be to open the window, murder, and rob the family. And old Linton brings them in and says to his wife, "Oh, my dear Mary, look here, don't be afraid, it is but a boy." Yet the villain scowls so plainly in his face. Would it not be a kindness to the country to hang him at once before he shows his nature and acts as well as features? This line not only snagged my attention, it ripped my attention because it is so relevant to what is going on today in the 21st century. This rhetoric is growing rampant and not being ridiculed as much as it should be. This assumption, not only, well, like for one, I love that we're never outright told that Heathcliff might be gypsy, that he might be black. You just know based off many interactions like this that there's something about him that you look at him and go, he's other. But we're also seeing many instances like this where because he looks other, you assume that he is a villain and he is worse, which is something that we still see today horribly. The assumptions, for example, the ICE raids, that because they look South American, we assume that they're criminals when that's not the case at often points. And wouldn't it be a kindness to the country to hang him, even though he had just said, "Don't be afraid, it is but a boy," as though he can't do much harm because it's just a boy, recognizing his childhood, but then throwing his childhood and supposed innocence aside based on an assumption of what he could potentially do, assuming it is within his nature to be a villain and to do horrible crimes. So why don't we nip it in the bud, even though there is no signs, nothing in this interaction at this moment to point towards this direction, assuming that you couldn't change your ways and become a better person. Well, maybe he could, Mr. Linton and his kind could change your ways and become a better person, but not someone like Heathcliff. So this is why I'm so frustrated that we are fixated on the toxic romance of this story. And like, for example, the new movie adaptation fixating on the sexual part of it when it's so minor to the story, when there's so many other themes to the story that would have been so much more important to hold a light to in this day and time. To really fixate, for example, on this moment when it is still occurring today. It's gotten worse today. Why aren't we fixating on this? So like you could go down a rabbit hole of conspiracy of why we fixate on the toxic romance of this and overhyping it and gaslighting of the romance. But the thing that makes me extremely sad is when adaptations and even the way that people are led to these stories causes people to miss and overlook more important themes and a lot of these stories we're reading. And it's not just Wuthering Heights, it could be something just as fluffy as Pride and Prejudice, is having deeper kind of philosophical conversations with the exterior of being fluffy. And we miss that because we're not close reading. We come in with a mindset of only looking for the romance. So that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this. And it makes me just extremely sad that one of the things I'm really frustrated with adaptations lately is that they don't shine the light on other aspects of these stories that are extremely relevant to what is going on today. And then immediately kind of paralleling or adding to this conversation is how quickly the Lintons change their tune and offer kindness when they realize who Kathy is, what her socioeconomic standing is. If she was another poor girl, even though she doesn't outwardly look like a gypsy, they assume she was a part of a robbing gang because she's hanging out with Heathcliff and wandering in the middle of the night, and it's probably a little dirty. So they could not have cared less that her ankle could have, lamed her for life. But the minute that Edgar realizes, wait, this is Miss Kathy of Wuthering Heights, of a landed gentry, all of a sudden they're of all this concern for her, that she would be lame for life and poor child, and they comfort her and all this stuff. And it's just the polarizing impression and how quickly they can change their tune when your social economic standing comes into play. And while I like Edgar Linton, it does make me question him. And I think because every other time I've read the story, I've been pushed to focus on the romance. I've seen Edgar as a better option than Heathcliff. And while he is a little bit more gentle physically and emotionally, doesn't mean I'm now realizing that he is just as bad because he has these biases that influences. Like, he could have offered kindnesses in other moments, he could have done more, but because of his standing and his upbringing, he adheres to the worst. And it's a passiveness too. He doesn't make the world better. There's a passiveness to him. And there was one more thing I was gonna say, but I cannot remember. But yeah, it was just the polar. Oh, I was gonna also say that the other thing with Kathy, so we're gonna see in a moment that she is kind of coddled and treated with kindness, and this is what lures her towards society. And we're seeing a manipulation that when you offer someone that has only kind of seen cruelness, especially in the last handful of years, when you get offered kindness, of course you're going to go to them willingly, that you're going to think that this is better until you realize that you were just kind of tricked into a cage. So there's a whole conversation we're going to be having about Kathy and society and all these things, but mostly I want to focus on the assumptions of these two based off appearance, and then how quickly they change their tune when they realize who Kathy is, her social economic standing, and then all of a sudden they offer kindness, whereas they did not before. I love when it's overcast and foggy like this while reading Wuthering Heights. Though it's not good lighting for filming, it's the atmosphere you want while reading Wuthering Heights. But getting back into this, Mrs. Linton declares Heathcliff as a wicked child. And at first you go, where are you getting this from? You're just assuming this, continuing a conversation I had previously. And she continues though by saying that, did you notice his language, Linton? I'm shocked that my children should have heard it. And Heathcliff admits to Nellie that he had started cursing again. And then I had this thought, where did he learn the curses from? Now, we definitively know how old Kathy was when Heathcliff arrived, which was, I believe, 6 or 7. I could go back a couple chapters and see, but we do have an actual written age. And we can assume Heathcliff is roughly her age, if not maybe a year or two older than her. That being said, like, he could have learned some of this language while living on the streets of Liverpool. Or did he learn these curses while living with the Earnshaws? Because he could have very easily discarded these curses while living with the Earnshaws and have been guided and nurtured to being kinder and not using that language anymore. But yet he doesn't, which there's nuance here. this assumption that, once again, I've already said in this chapter that Heathcliff, the curses could have a kind of double entendre to it, where like he's cursing, like saying curse words, or he's cursing you as in a witchcraft s, which fits into the stereotype of him being a gypsy esque appearance or heritage. But also, like, so you're assuming then it's in his nature. Either way, either version of the curses, you're assuming it's within his nature that this would be a natural kind of language that he would have, that he's so uncivilized. But I'm sitting here wondering, are these curses so common? Is Joseph cursing at him as he beats him? Is Hindley cursing at him as he beats him? Is this just something that he has learned that you do when you're in a fit of rage? Or like, why is he cursing in this moment? Why is this the moment that he feels like he needs to curse? We should be questioning that, because he curses at the dog that bit Kathy. Is it because of, tales that they heard? Because he said that he had cursed at the dog as if it would scare even a demon kind of esque. So is it because of the what you read in the Bible? So he thinks that you need to do it here to ward them away, as if it was an exorcist. Like, I'm not very religious myself, so I can't say, but these are the thoughts I'm having. And once again, like, we should be questioning, like, where did he learn this? Where did he learn to apply curse words like this? Because if you're around kids, they're not going to learn curse words unless they hear it from parents or peers. And even then, they sometimes don't apply it correctly at first. And then they start learning how to apply it correctly. But where did they learn that? They learned it from others. So where is Heathcliff learning this from? Heathcliff tells Nellie that he had refused to leave the house without Kathy, but yet he was overpowered and kind of thrown out into the night with a lantern and told to return to Wuthering Heights. And there's a lot I want to unpack here. One, I keep trying, I keep accidentally imagining them younger than they are. I have to remind myself that they're approximately 12 to 14. Like, Kathy's, I think, about 12 at this point, and Heathcliff is anywhere from 12 to 14. So it's weird because that is such a weird in between age, even for the child themselves, but like for adults looking down on them. Because if you think about it, the Linton children are too old to be carrying on the way that they were, that they're squabbling and crying in such a way that makes you kind of automatically picture them being younger. But then, like, Kathy, who's 12, is about to be thrust into being a young lady, which feels like she's too young for that. So it's such a weird in between kind of period. But the reason why I'm thinking about their age is that I'm like, poor Heathcliff, he's just a child and has to walk out in the moors by himself, which, like, yes, him and Kathy had come there, you know, on their own, but they were together. And, like, I don't know. Like, I think I'm thinking of it in a 21st century point of view, but moving past that, let's look at the blue curtain aspect of this line, because the lantern should snag your attention, because lanterns are lights and they usually symbolize enlightenment or, a higher being, knowing, those kind of like symbolism. And so having the lantern thrust into him, Heathcliff's not being thrust into the dark entirely. He's being thrown out of society, but he's kind of, in my head, my brain immediately went to, it's like giving him the Bible. Like, here's a Bible. Be a better person, but you got to do it on your own. Get out. And expecting him to be a better person on his own without guidance is how I immediately saw this this, how I interpreted it. There's so many other ways you can interpret it. And like, I would love to know how you would interpret this excerpt and like this moment, because I think there's a nuance to it. Not only is he, being thrust into the dark, being told that, his keeper, Mr. Earnshaw, should be told of how he has acted, but with a lantern. And I think like the lantern snagged me because you would think that they would just throw him out in the dark, but they don't. So it's like they're doing the bare minimum of being considered good Christians. It's like, well, here's the light. In a context of both, like, here's a little bit of safety from the dark, but also here's something to make you better. Like, I don't know. Like, there's something there, and I would love to know what you think is there. Heathcliff, refusing to leave just yet, watches from the window as Kathy is brought onto like a couch, and Mrs. Linton personally removes the gray cloak of a dairymaid that they had stolen for their adventure. And he says that there's shaking her head and expostulating with her, I suppose. She was a young lady, and they made a distinction between her treatment and mine. And there's a nuance to young lady, as I've mentioned previously in this chapter, that they're saying young lady in the sense that she's of a higher class than Heathcliff, and that's why their treatment with the two of them is vastly different and it suddenly changed. But then we're also going to see how her shaking her head and expostulating is because young ladies shouldn't be acting like this, shouldn't be out in the night acting wild. And then this is kind of the start of shoving Kathy towards fitting into societal expectations of what she's supposed to be like because of her gender and how she's supposed to act. And again, her age, she's just 12. Which again, that's such a weird because when I think of like 12-year-olds, I think of myself as a 12-year-old. As I was 12, I thought I was so much older than I was. And I look at 12-year-olds and like my 12-year-old cousins, I see them as still kids, but at the same time, I expect them to act a very certain way. So there's this weird thing that we're putting on kids that I've never really thought about. It kind of makes it hard on them too. So it's a weird kind of, they don't know if they're kids or adults, and we don't know if they're kids or adults, and we're kind of seeing that being played out here, which is so fun. Kind of that Emily Bronte is kind of very subtly having this conversation herself back in the 1800s. The other detail I picked up on is how they had, removed her cloak, Mrs. Linton, and then the woman servant brought a basin of warm water and washed her feet. And washed her feet, which, like, yes, her feet are dirty because Heathcliff already said that, like, she had lost her shoes out in the moors. I couldn't think of the word. I was going to say bog, heath, moors. So her feet are dirty, but there's another layer to this. It's a very religious layer. The washing of the feet is almost like reverence. And to me, that's so interesting because of how Kathy is kind of this gravitational force that others are drawn to and then becomes a black hole and sucks everyone in my opinion. Like, I have a slightly negative perspective of Kathy, though not completely, because she's nuanced, and I think that there was a lot that was done wrong to her, or she could have been shaped differently. Like, there's a lot of things working here, and but still she is kind of a black hole, and there's this gravitational pull that everyone is drawn into. We see the Lintons are about to be drawn into this pull, and Nellie is, and Heathcliff is, and so many people are, and they forgive her for a lot of her ill doing. Look at the language Nellie had used when she first described Kathy as a child, the horribleness, but then she would smile and then be like, "You forgot it." And it's almost like she's about to become a cult leader, is my first thought. And she's not, but she has that kind of like power over these people, and the washing of the feet, I think, is the first step. There's something there. Let me know what you think about it. I want to read this excerpt before I get into it. So we have Mrs. Linton took off the gray cloak of the dairymaid, which we had borrowed from our excursion, shaking her head and expostulating with her, I suppose. She was a young lady, and they made a distinction between her treatment and mine. Then the woman servant brought a basin of warm water and washed her feet, and Mr. Linton mixed a tumbler of negus, and Isabella emptied a plate full of cakes into her lap, and Edgar stood gaping at a distance. Afterwards, I dried and combed her beautiful hair, and gave her a pair of enormous slippers, and wheeled her to the fire, and I left her, as merry as she could be, dividing her food between the little dog and Skulker, whose nose she pinched as he ate, and kindling a spark of spirit in the vacant blue eyes of the Lintons, a dim reflection from her own enchanting face. I saw they were full of stupid admiration. She is so immeasurably superior to them, to everybody on earth, is she not, Nellie? So, there's a lot of things I can dig into. So on one hand, it's continuing this conversation I had with the feet washing, that Kathy is this gravitational pull, and she's this mix of a sun and a black hole, which makes sense. A star is bright, beautiful, but can then combust into a black hole and suck everyone in. That is how I imagine Kathy. That is the metaphor I see Kathy as, and they're enchanted by her. But the thing is that they will quickly then convert her to be like them. They want her to be like them, and it dims some of her enchantingness. The thing that makes her so enchanting is being dimmed to then fit in. They don't let her be herself, and they don't realize what that does to her. It's kind of like being enchanted by a wild animal, but then when you bring a wild animal into a zoo, they aren't as enchanting. They get dimmer because their life is more confined. But also, like, I want to like fixate, like, not only on they so fixated on her, but the other detail that caught my eye was Edgar standing in the corner gaping at her. And there's a couple things that you can pick at. So one, you can see that Edgar kind of sees her as almost, you could say, a fairy queen. We don't know exactly what he says or how he would describe her in this moment, but you kind of get this idea that he sees her as almost like a fairy queen, that she seems mythical, unreal, like something that you desire, like, to be with, to have. And like, I don't know, like, I have to keep reading and see if my opinion of Linton changes, because I never see him as quite conquering, but maybe there is a part of him that we just don't quite see, but is so subconsciously a part of him that he wants to own her as, a elite white kind of imperialist sensibility that they would be in the midst of in this era. We're seeing the expansion of Britain and worshiping her, and it's kind of putting her on a pedestal, which, like, I think Kathy likes, but simultaneously puts a lot of pressure on her to then fulfill this idea that he has of her, whereas Heathcliff thinks that he sees the real her, and at least a version of her that Kathy feels a little bit more comfortable in. The last thing I want to point at is Heathcliff leaving her, which I think is very fascinating, that in this moment he sees that she is happy and is willing to finally leave her behind. But yet, when she marries Edgar Linton, he is not willing to leave her behind. He's not willing to leave her there, even if she claims she would be happier in this situation. And on one hand, he's not wrong that she isn't going to be happy. She's going to be confined, and she's not entirely. But at the same time, Heathcliff isn't the best person for her either. So, like, Kathy's story, while she is a black hole, in my opinion, simultaneously is tragic because there's a lose-lose situation. If she stays with what Heathcliff represents and is purely herself, she would be alone and ostracized because she does not adhere to what society expects. But if she adheres to what society expects, part of her soul kind of is dulled or confined. So this is, you can get into that a lot. One last thing I want to touch on with that previous quote also is the vacant blue eyes, a spark of life that in the Linton's eyes that Heathcliff notes. And I think it's showing, like, their life is dull, it's simple, it's safe. And Kathy comes in and adds life to it, but this life also adds danger to it. And, like, to live is to live with danger. And I don't know how to, like, pick at this, but, like, there was just, like, it caught my attention because, like, he's noting that Kathy brought life to them, but yet simultaneously being with them sucks the life out of Kathy. Like, or is Heathcliff the one that sucks the life out of Kathy? Like, again, like, it's been a handful of years, so, like, I'm very intrigued to see what I pick up on this close read, because I'm uncovering things that, like, I never noticed before. I can give you an answer later down the line, putting forth and, like, having us, go, let's think about this later, think about this detail now. The rest of this chapter ends with Nellie kind of forewarning that this adventure that they went on is going to be pivotal. It's going to change everything, and it does. And there's a lot of rippling repercussions for it, because while Heathcliff does kind of get punished, he is not flogged as much as you would assume he would be, especially after Hindley himself received a very intense lecture from Mr. Linton on the way that Hindley is guiding his family. We're seeing this pressure put on Hindley. Again, reminder, Hindley is in his early 20s at this point. Like, he's still kind of a child himself. Most likely, under an age where his frontal cortex would be fully developed and was not guided to fit this role. Like he knew he would have this role, but he was not guided in how to perform the role. And then you have an older gentleman like Mr. Linton kind of lecturing him. But they knew that Heathcliff, the greatest punishment to him would not be flogging, but to separate him from Kathy, they realized. And this is a great punishment for him. Like it really does harm him. But this adventure, this them running off to the Lintons, does have a ripple effect because Kathy now has the lure of society. She sees this appeal to it, this false appeal to it for her personally. But in this moment, it looks enchanting, and she's finally willing to change her ways a little bit, or at least we're led to believe that. And I think it's kind of like the way like you lead a horse to water. Like I think it's done with kindness and gentleness and a soft censure than harsh, religious texture that what she was getting in Wuthering Heights. She's getting at Rushcross Grange. So I think she's seen the allure, fancy clothes, good food, being, coddled, luring her towards this change. We'll see in the next chapter this change. And, Hindley's wife, again, we don't get a name. We just see that Mrs. Earnshaw would keep her sister-in-law in due restraint. And I think the term is very important, restraint. That to abide and be a part of society, to be especially a young lady in the society, you're restrained, you're confined to adhering. And someone so happy suffers for that, for not adhering to that. But yes, this adventure that they had gone on is a pivotal moment. This is a turning point for the two of them because by going on this adventure, if they had not gone on this adventure, more likely than not, they would have at least prolonged being shoved into these roles and fitting into society. And they would have probably withstood it a little bit more, not been lured by it as much as going to the Lintons had lured Kathy, which then later lures Heathcliff. So this changes everything for them is what I'm trying to get at. This is a very pivotal moment, and like I said, there's this imagery of the darkness of Wuthering Heights. The lights are off when they leave, but there's a glow across the dark moors of Freshcross Grange. There's this allure of the richness, the coziness of their house, and then being coddled, like all these things. But like Lintons represent society and how they're going to treat someone like Kathy and how they're going to treat someone like Heathcliff. With Kathy, they're going to constrain but coddle her, and with Heathcliff, they assume the worst and much rather hang him, as I said. So there are two themes right here that I would much rather have an adaptation put light towards, talk about, than the toxic romance, because these are something that we're seeing still relevant today and are very important conversations to have today.